Hello, and welcome back to Spinalcast. I'm your host, David Stevens, and joining us today is Matthew Rodreick. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Honored to be asked for an interview. Thank you.
Perfect. So Matthew is an executive director for Unite to Fight Paralysis, and he's also an advocate and activist for the SCI community, and we're excited to have you here on the podcast. So without further ado, I think we should just get into it.
Let's go.
All right, perfect. So I guess first question I would have would be, what got you involved with spinal cord injury in the first place?
Sure. Like a lot of people, it was my son who was not a lot of people whose son was injured, but a family member.
Okay.
So in 2008, my son was about 15. A couple of weeks before his 16th birthday, he was on a student exchange program. Body surfing in the Pacific, dove under a wave, hit a sandbar, hyperextended, and broke his neck. As with a lot of people in our community, that completely upended our lives. And pretty much everything stopped for a while.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, left my career, became my son's caregiver, and companion, traveler, best friend, coach, trainer, all that sort of stuff for the next couple of years. And then as he adjusted to his injury and became a little more independent, moved on out on his own, then I became an advocate and activist eventually for the community.
Awesome. So you mentioned that he was abroad when the injury happened. Whereabouts in the world, as far as abroad is concerned?
Yeah, sure. He was in Costa Rica.
Okay.
Specifically, the injury happened at Manuel Antonio State Park, which is on the edge of the rainforest. It was, I think it was a week, I can't even remember now, a week or 2 weeks into the student exchange program where all these kids from all over went to a variety of families all over the country in Costa Rica. And they all came back together. They were having a barbecue on the beach, and it was just play day, fun day. And in that afternoon, he sustained a spinal cord injury, which was a drag.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. Thank you for the background on on Gabriel and kind of that story and how you've gotten into this. Jumping more to the work you've done as an advocate, I think you were pretty pivotal in the passing of the Minnesota SCI TBI Research Grant Program in the state of Minnesota, and I was just kind of interested in that process and just having you talk a little bit more about that program.
Well, I mean, the great full circle thing is the idea for that effort came when I discovered the organization that I now work for, which was back in 2010. I went to one of Unite to Fight Paralysis annual symposia, and it was there that I think it was either 2010 or 2011, one of those years in Phoenix. They do an annual science and advocacy meeting. Used to be called Working to Walk, and I went there and I heard someone talk about or present something about the passage of a state bill. And how it supported research. And then there were other presentations there of people who had been recipients of that kind of state funding. And I paid very close attention to that. And I talked to a few people. And as soon as I got back from that meeting, I called up my representative and I said, hey, here's what I want to try to do. And that was 2011, and I got my butt kicked a few times around the Capitol because I didn't know anything. I was very green.
I can't imagine anybody for the first time knows anything. It's an unfair advantage.
Yeah, but it's like you're a rookie and an idealist, and you're passionate. You want to do something for your kid, and people like him, and to you it's kind of a no-brainer. You were just at a meeting where you realize advances in science are coming from they're being sort of percolated up via this funding mechanism that's been passed in a number of states, mostly on the East Coast and also in California in the 90s. And I got a very quick education into other people's money and buckets of money and protected initiatives and programs. But long and short of it, over the next few years, I started to learn, started to pay attention. Unite to Fight Paralysis connected me with a number of advocates from around the country and even in Europe and Asia. Had regular meetings to strategize. I learned a lot from them that really built the bones of what became the bill that we passed in 2015. After a lot of people from the community joined in, that took a couple of years.
Yeah.
If my wife was here, she'd tell you how often I would come home from the Capitol and complain that nobody's showing up, nobody believes this is possible. Everybody's like, but slowly, a handful of people started to buy in and commit. The folks that would end up, we founded Get Up, Stand Up to Cure Paralysis, kind of out of that effort, which is a local nonprofit that's running a peer support group and funding some research and activity-based therapy initiatives. So we passed the bill in 2015. It was a $1 million appropriation, really based on fundamentally 4 things: that it was going to be a competitive program, open to anyone doing the research, so not institution specific. 1, that it would have low indirect cost rates, which a lot of the large institutions have very high indirect cost rates for granting research, 50, 60% even of so 50 cents of every dollar goes into the indirect keeping lights on and et cetera.
Overhead, basically.
Yeah, so we mandated a low 8% indirect cost rate. We also used language that was very targeted, so we wanted to give preference to research that was pursuing recovery of function for people living with the injury. It's kind of a tame way of saying cure for chronic injury, which was very specific for us. And then lastly, and most importantly, we wanted to place people with spinal cord injuries and people like myself, family members, on an advisory board that would oversee alongside experts, clinicians, researchers, with equal weight to sort of prioritize, okay, what are we going to fund and why and to what end? And so those 4 things really kind of made the bones of the research. It was successful right out of the gate, and 2 years later, we went from $1 million to $6 million appropriation, and it still exists to this day.
That's fantastic. I love the story of persistence there, and the importance of persistence is really key. I also like how the program utilizes people from the scientific community along with people who are maybe not as scientific in their background, because I think that's very key to making valuable decisions, is having people from different backgrounds. And I think a lot of times when you get a lot of really, really smart people in one room, if they're all really, really smart at the same thing, they can, arrive to some different conclusions. So I think that's great.
Yeah, for me, I didn't know it at the time. I was getting an informal education from the organization that I mentioned that I now work for and run, Unite to Fight Paralysis, which is very committed to this notion of if the spinal cord injury community believes and wants there to be curative treatments, then they need to educate themselves about this research system, not just science itself, but the sort of system around the science, in order to appropriately and effectively influence it, and primarily to bring the experience of our reality to that system.
Right.
And I mean, that thinking has matured over time, but I sort of not fully appreciating or recognizing the importance and value of the people who are closest to the problem need to be at the table to solve it.
Totally.
And so that's what we've been trying to build through. And so since Minnesota, we passed similar bills in Washington State, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and now we're very close to passing in Wisconsin.
Fantastic.
And then we're still working in a couple other states that are little further out.
And these are all efforts through Unite to Fight Paralysis.
Yeah.
And what other initiatives are kind of going on there that you're heading up or you're involved with?
Unite to Fight Paralysis?
Yeah.
Sure.
So let's kind of like jump into that.
Yeah, okay.
I just figured we could kind of, veer off a little bit and get a little more into that side of
well, obviously, things. So one, we call it the Cure Advocacy Network, or CAN, and that's our state initiative. We have a couple of guys, both who have injuries, Jake Beckstrom, Jason Stouffer, who run that program.
Okay.
And we essentially, reach out to our community, or our community reaches out to us. They hear about what we accomplished and said, hey, can we do it in, like that's what happened in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They reached out to us and said, hey, we want to do that here. Can you help us? So
right.
We do. And so that's one facet of what we do. We also continue to do our annual symposium. We dropped the Work in the Walk a couple of years ago. We just call it the U2FP Annual Science and Advocacy Symposium. It's a scientific meeting that is created, curated, designed, executed by our community, people with spinal cord injury and family members like me. The idea is, again, to put the lens of the lived experience on top of the science and present a very highly scientific meeting, which is intended to educate and mobilize and engage our community towards advocacy initiatives. We also do a podcast, like you guys.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that.
Called CureCast. We've done a little over 70 episodes. Mostly we interview scientists, grab the state of research. We also do some advocacy stuff and some educational stuff. We're going to do a series coming up here on spinal stimulation, which is very popular in the minds of a lot of people with spinal cord injury.
The epidermal stimulator stuff?
Yeah.
Epidural,
yep.
Yes.
Epidural, transcutaneous, percutaneous. There's some other variations, but what we've been sort of paying attention to is that a lot of people in the community don't really understand what it is, what it's doing, what it's not doing, and who some of the players are and who the history is. So we're going to kind of do a whole series to try to unpack that and really help people understand what's going on.
That's awesome.
We also have a scientific advisory board, which is a service that's utilized to nonprofits. We're kind of pivoting that away, as you all know, Peter knows, that we're trying to attract science, SCI foundations that fund science into really highly impactful translational research projects.
Okay.
Collectively. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these different foundations, they might fund a couple, $300,000-$400,000 a year. Well, what if we could put those dollars together across 5 or 6 foundations? Now we can fund something maybe more significant and more translationally ready, meaning like how do you get a discovery towards human beings and on a pathway towards commercialization, towards clinical implementation.
Yeah.
We also we have a new program that we call Lab Rats, where we have about 15 people with spinal cord injuries who are acting as consultants in research labs. So like we're placing them in a lab either virtually or in person, in a weekly or monthly meeting with SCI research lab to talk about the lived experience and, kind of find out what the lab is doing, answer any questions for the students or postdocs or even principal investigators to kind of, again, foster a relationship between those who live with the injury and those who research the injury.
That is so unbelievably pivotal, and from the doctors we've interviewed on this show and that I've met through my time with MCPF, it's been, every single one of them has a very specific connection with spinal cord injury, and it's typically through someone who's been injured, and remembering that person and keeping that person in mind and helping that drive their want and their will. And I think, when you get really down in the weeds in your lab, it's probably very difficult to keep that at the top of your mind. And so I like that idea.
It is, and it's it's very nice to hear you say that from the scientists you've interviewed. My estimation is that that's not common.
Oh.
So a lot of folks are in this field or doing this work and have really had little contact to no contact with a person with a spinal cord injury, and
that
really don't understand,
better.
Necessarily what people are dealing with or living with. We have a few stories of where experiments have been re-engineered because of the input of a person with spinal cord injury saying, that's not really how it is in life. So if you really want to model your animal study to something that's clinically relevant, you might want to do it this way.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of those instances. It's great to hear, and I do know there's plenty of scientists out there who do have relationships.
No, absolutely.
Or even got into this work because of some connection like that.
Well, and I think your point is valid as well. I mean, there are going to be, extremes in all directions, but I think it's key that your organization is making it a point to make sure that people who have suffered an injury and are dealing with it on a daily basis are as involved as they possibly can be, and keep them at the forefront, because that's how you drive change for those individuals versus...
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that this is a shift that's been happening across the field. CDMRP, which is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, has a division that's called SCRP, which is the Spinal Cord Injury Research Program. Mm-hmm. When they started, they began to mandate that if you're going to get funded by the DoD through this SCRP program, you have to have a consultant in your lab. And they had sort of stipulations around what that was, so that they were trying to make it so it's not tokenized.
Yeah.
You don't just have somebody sitting in the corner, reading a book.
Right.
Or, but they're actually engaged in this project in some way or another. The North American SCI Consortium, which I was on the executive council when it formed, is now about to launch their education portal, which is a way in a lot of different areas like advocacy, but also like science acumen, to help people with spinal cord injuries ready themselves so they could also participate like this. So there's a number of areas where this is growing. We kind of launched our lab rats, we knew that it's something we had good relationships with scientists, good relationships with the community. Let's go make this happen. I think it's something that we're going to see continued growth in. We're even trying to make some efforts with other funders to look at how they might do what the DoD is doing similarly. How do you get more community involvement into the research process?
Well, you started kind of talking about this a little bit with the education piece, but that does kind of raise a question for me of, these people or lab rats, as you've alluded to, do they have some sort of background in science so that they have some knowledge going in, so it's not completely they're in the dark and unable to have a conversation with these people?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, amongst our group, it really runs the gamut. So you have people like we have a guy in our group yet to be placed in a lab. He's a neurosurgeon. Ran clinical trials, then sustained an injury from a cycling accident. Have people in other areas of science like engineering.
Yeah.
Some who are just very interested in the science and who've kind of done some self-education.
Totally.
And then others who know very little, to nothing, and are willing to engage
and learn.
And so we had a group of 5 or 6 that worked with a couple of researchers at Texas A&M who just recently published a few months back a clinical trial survey. What's happening, looking at clinicaltrials.gov, which is the main source of where you go to find the clinical trials in spinal cord injury and other conditions.
Right.
And look at, okay, well, what's being done? What are the trials that are happening? What are they researching? Who are they? Where are they? That kind of stuff. And so we sent 5 or 6 people with SCI to consult with them, and they brought a whole host of other questions. sort of looking a little deeper than the basic, are scientists doing what the community wants, was the basic question.
Right.
And the people with SEI were like, well, wait a minute, there's some other things we need to know. Like, well, what is this a clinical trial, or is this human clinical research? Is this moving to the FDA to get approval for something, or
right.
is somebody just asking a question, or are they just like throwing stuff against the wall to see if it sticks, like very experimental. They also wanted to know, well, who's funding these things?
Right.
They wanted to know who's collaborating. They wanted to know within categories, like, why is everybody seeming to do neuromodulation now, like spinal stimulation, because that's the hot topic and there's money available. And should they be all doing that? Do they have the expertise? So they were asking a lot more sort of complex and nuanced questions.
It's a complicated hierarchy as well.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, this isn't totally related, but my brother is a professor at Madison, and he's been working in academia now for 5, 6, 7, 10 years now, and it's a completely different world from what I've grown to learn in my own business sense. And so I can only imagine that the scientific community is very similar, in that the hierarchy and how things get funded, or where money comes from, and who's doing what, and why you would submit this there and not over here. And it's it's also all over the place. I'm glad that they were willing to ask those questions and get that clarity. So,
well, and that, when you bring that up, I'll throw the last thing in of what U2FP does over the last few years. What we've established are these, what we call work groups. You could think of them as like think tanks.
Yeah.
And we've created several of them now. One is focused on translational research, which I mentioned earlier, is this kind of idea of how does a scientific discovery in a lab somewhere, in a dish or in an animal, how does that discovery become a treatment? Right. Like, what does that pipeline look like, or that wheel that a lot of people refer to, the translational wheel? I invited a number of scientists, clinicians, and spinal cord injury foundations about 3.5 years ago. Would you be willing to form a group with me? We meet twice a month and have for 3.5 years to sort of do what you guys do here in this company.
Right.
A system analysis. What's the problem space? What's going on in this space that are disincentivizing or obstacles to things moving forward? And then from that analysis, can we set a sort of recommendation space, like a solution space? And then from that solution space, can we syndicate those recommendations? So not just like publish a paper and say, hey, we think you should do this, but actually embody something, a consortium or a leading group or a bunch of different groups to say, we're going to enact these recommendations and see what happens. And then lastly, essentially towards the delivery of combinatorial treatments for spinal cord injury. So we've been meeting, looking at these sort of system problems. And we talked about your brother.
Yep.
And there's politics, there's money, there's incentives, there's disincentives. One of the things that a lot of the scientists that we've talked to within the translational working group, we just interviewed over 70, you could call stakeholders in this space. People with spinal cord injury, clinicians, researchers, funders of science,
right,
and entrepreneurs, like people who started companies, and asked them, what are the problems? What are the disincentives? What would you fix if you could?
Right.
And what it would look like. And one of the things we heard from scientists is that the one thing that I'm not, my performance is not measured on is what I discover. What I'm measured on is how many grants do I get? How many publications do I put out? In what kind of journals?
Yeah.
How many students came to my lab and through my lab? Where did they come from? Where did they go? What kind of service did I do? Like, was I in study sections? Would I review journal publications? What kind of help did I do? That a lot of this to draw attention to the university that I work for, the system that I work for, to increase its status. And I'm not really measured on, well, what did I discover?
All that
and what
work
does it mean?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, what does it mean to people who have the condition that I'm researching, no matter what, beyond spinal cord injury? But that's a wake-up call, And I don't disparage any of those scientists. We're all working within this system that a lot of people forget which I think is a human problem. Like, we all live in these ecosystems. We inhabit these ecosystems.
Totally.
That we don't necessarily understand how they work, or why am I incentivized to go left here instead of right or straight? And, should I even go for,
totally.
All those questions, we don't think about them.
No.
And so I think what we believe at U2FP is you need somebody who cares about these questions and ask them in the right places with the right people at the right time to see what we can influence to help our community get treatments that are meaningful.
That's awesome. And I think it's cool that you were able to get that level of transparency with the people you interviewed too. I think that's probably a difficult point for people to take a step back and look from 100 feet at themselves and say, what really is the problems here? What am I actually facing? I think we all get so droned in on what it is we're doing. It can be hard to step back and look at things like that. So that sort of transparency is very cool. So kind of
yeah, I just want to say, add one more little piece is the other thing is, I don't want to get way too much in the weeds or nuance, but the other part is I don't know that everybody, all the things I described.
Yeah.
I think there are some scientists, and I know there are some scientists that would say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. The system is designed in a certain way or set up in a certain way that if it works right, it's going to deliver those discoveries.
Right.
And so again, it's not, sometimes early on in my advocacy, I would get angry. These are things that would really infuriate me, get me agitated, and I'd be looking for villains, in the system. And I'm not like that anymore. I think, there are probably some villains out there somewhere, but
everywhere.
It's really this, there are people, and I think most of us are like this, we just want to believe that the systems work,
100%.
That everything is kind of made like it's supposed to be made. And at the end of the day, I think people with a spinal cord injury, people who live through something so traumatic, so difficult, so challenging, and the higher, you guys know, Peter's high level injury, so demanding. It's us who are able to say, wait, this system we have isn't good enough right now. There's some tweaks and adjustments that we can make to improve it, because there are people who really need it. I don't think everybody appreciates how much it is needed.
Well, and it's the blind hope that is given by everybody who is dealt with an injury and not involved with an organization like yourself, that they don't have the ability to get themselves in front of and make sure that this is all happening correctly. There has to be this blind faith that the system is working, and so it's refreshing to hear that organizations like yourself are there doing this work so that there is some sort of standing for that blind faith. There is someone out there who's looking out for them and saying, we are going to make sure that this is going the way it needs to go to get you the help that you need. And I think that's pivotal.
Yeah. And sometimes challenge, a scientist once told me, I won't name the person's name, that, we're here to give hope to people like you. And I said, no, you're not. You're here to deliver discoveries that are meaningful to my community, not to instill hope in me that someday you're going to do something.
Right.
You're here to make discoveries and use your scientific knowledge and brilliance and passion and work and connection to deliver something.
Right.
Because hope could be an empty, painful
hope doesn't make anybody walk.
Process. Right. Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I totally understand that. So kind of the last question here before I think we close out. What are some strategies that you have for, future advocacy and that you're hoping to kind of dive into a bit further in the future here?
Sure. Well, I've hinted at one of them, which is this translational work group. We run a couple of others similarly in other sectors. We're working on neuromodulation, convening a lot of scientists that do that work and looking at, this is the first thing that looks like it's going to be meaningful for people with spinal cord injury. It's not a cure by any stretch of the imagination, at least what I know of it, even though sometimes it gets maybe hyped like that in the media or even in our community, it's not curative, but it might restore some functions that are meaningful enough for us to pay attention to.
Well, I think you raise a really good point there. It's something we were talking about this company, Clientech, that we're recording in here. One of the big things that we push for is we want to give value early and often, even if it's a small amount, but regular delivery of value is very key to keeping people driven and keeping people excited. And so being able, even though it might not be a cure, if it's a benefit, a very realizable, if that's a word, benefit, that's really key to those people. I mean, if I can get, if I've been in a wheelchair like Peter for 20 some odd years and I've never moved my toes, and all of a sudden you tell me I can do this and all of a sudden I'll be able to move my toes, that's a bigger deal than I think a lot of people think it is, just in the mentality of it.
Yeah, it's really, really complicated and nuanced in our community, because those things have to have meaningful impact. So for instance, like using spinal stimulation, there are people who've moved their legs.
Right.
And that, I've talked to them, and they, for the first time in years, right, that all of a sudden they are through their own voluntary control are moving their foot or kicking out their leg, or that, that's exciting.
Yes.
But is it functional?
Right.
Like, does it mean they're going to walk? No. Does it mean they might be able to transfer themselves without the help of a caregiver? Maybe. Does it mean they could maybe stand up for a period of time to have that demand placed on their cardiovascular system and get them off their butt, for pressure sort? Like, there are really difficult questions that have to be sort of mined to understand, well, how meaningful is this?
Right.
Right? Because you could take that, you could sort of I'm not much of an incrementalist, even though sometimes I get accused of it. Like, I want a full-blown regenerative cure from my son,
right,
Peter, and all the people that I know. That's my brass ring goal vision.
Yeah.
But at the same time, man, there are fires that are burning for people now, with accelerated aging and hypertrophy and loss of musculature, bone loss, pressure sores, infections, cardiovascular disease, all kinds of complicated things.
Totally.
Or even just psychologically, the need to have dependents or caregivers and all that sort of stuff. You can't neglect that. And so there's this really weird tension in our community between getting the system to do something truly innovative and not just say, we're going to fix spasticity, right? Or we're going to target some singular condition, like we're going to fix your bladder so you don't have to catheterize anymore.
Right.
I'm of the opinion, like some, and I think few scientists, that if you can get at the source of the problem, there's a mechanical injury to the spinal cord. Mm-hmm. And you've lost cells, you've lost connections, and there's some secondary complications that come from that. If you can get to the source of it and fix it, you've fixed a whole host of those problems, mm-hmm. even if you fix them a little bit. And so it's really complex to sort of figure out what your targets are in this community. And that's where, so back to your question, like one kind of overarching theme for us that's been guiding how we think about the coming years and the work that we do. I mentioned all the different initiatives that we do. We're probably going to stick with most of them. We do find that these work groups are a really effective place to sort of play this out. Is if you think about this system, a lot of people use the metaphor of a wheel, translational wheel. Okay. You go from discovery across the wheel to the translation towards models that mimic humans, to research, to vetting, to commercialization and dissemination broadly, globally. Right? So you have this wheel of bringing something around, and then it feeds back into the wheel. You've done it in humans, and you've learned things, and you go back to the bench. bench to bedside. You may have heard that kind of term. Well, taking that image of the wheel, one of the things that has been guiding us for a little while now is the idea that spinal cord injury, the lived experience, is the hub of that wheel. Everybody who's in this process is connected to that hub.
Right.
You're a scientist, you're researching it. If you're a clinician, you're treating it. If you're an activist like me, you're trying to influence this system to pay attention to the hub. If you're a capitalist, an entrepreneur, you're trying to make money off this thing.
Right.
And help people, right? So everybody's connected to this hub. And if you take that as a bicycle wheel, the rim of the wheel is how you get from here to there, or the tire, whatever. You can, explore the metaphor how you want.
Yeah.
Everybody connects to the hub through a spoke.
Right.
So they are that spoke. I'm a scientist, I'm a clinician, I'm a funder of science, public or private, Peter Morton or NIH, right?
Yep.
I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to start a company to help a discovery get out into the world.
Right.
Each of them are spoke. The way the wheel stays true is
having enough spokes
and
having them spread out all over the place.
Enough tension. Those spokes have to be tightened against one another, right?
Yep.
All around the wheel. Anybody who's had a bicycle wheel and who's done I used to ride a lot.
Yeah.
My wheels would go out of true all the time. I commuted and city riding,
wobble,
potholes,
wheel
right?
wobble.
Yeah, and your wheel wobbles and it's no longer going straight,
right?
Or it's inefficient to keep it going straight.
Yeah.
So you have to create an effective tension between those players. And the way that metaphor works in our minds is because the scientist is looking at their dashboard. A person with spinal cord injury is looking at the reality of their experience. A clinician is looking at here's how I treat people. What happens is each of their realities are not necessarily merging or overlapping.
Right.
A scientist might be doing something that is of no concern or consequence to a person living with a spinal cord injury. Or they might think they've discovered something that a clinician says, well, I could never. How are you going to treat that?
Right.
How are we going to get insurance to pay for this? How are we going to, everybody has a different. The entrepreneur might say, well, we can't, that's great, but we can't make money off that. It's a one-time treatment. It's going to cost $500 million to get whatever. We can't turn that into a product. And so everybody has to have a say to keep this thing on target and on track with the hub, people who live with this injury. Right. So that's kind of like a guiding principle. I hope that makes sense. It's not a very specific, we're going to do 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, no.
But we're going to use this notion of how do we promote effective tension between these core spokes, these core players, to make this wheel run straight, run smooth, and get from A to B for our community. That's kind of the driving principle behind what we're trying to do.
That couldn't have been a better way to finish this off. That was a great analogy. The metaphor, I think, was very well put. So thank you again for joining us today on Spinalcast.
Thanks for having me. Really honored to be here. Really
Perfect. Well, everyone on YouTube, there's going to be information about Matthew, Unite to Fight Paralysis, all sorts of stuff. We're going to put it all in the description, so make sure you head down there and check it out. While you're there, you might as well, give us a like, comment, subscribe, all those good things. If you're listening to us on a podcast platform, you could always give us a follow. Otherwise, thanks again, and hopefully we'll get to talk to you again soon.
I really appreciate it, and I just want to give a shameless plug for my son, Gabriel.
Oh, absolutely.
Who goes by Freak. You can find him on Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, gigging musician, really fantastic stuff.
Awesome.
But really writes out of a lot of the work that he's done really comes out of this place of living with a spinal cord injury. So those of you out there in the community who haven't heard of him, you might want to check him out. You may not like his music, it's a little...
It's stylized.
Yeah, it's his style, but...
Perfect.
But I think the lyrics, man, you just would be moved by. So, shameless plug.
Awesome. We'll put that in the description, too.
All right, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in a month.